Let me begin by saying this: if you ever get possessed by something, or if something targets you or follows you around, it's no joke. From my own experience, I can tell you that going for 1 or 2 simple purifications usually isn't enough. It'll eat away at you, slowly, over a long time. And most of the time, you can't just banish it outright. In my case, it lasted about 2.5 years. For the record, I'm physically fine now, and I can live a fairly normal life. But sadly, I can't say for sure that it's truly over. Let me start at the beginning. I was 23 at the time, a first-year employee at a small company. Because the company was small, there weren't many new hires, so we all grew close by default. One of my coworkers, a guy named Ken from the Tohoku region, knew all kinds of odd things and had an unusually large network of acquaintances. You know those stories: if you do X, then Y will happen, or if you do this ritual, that spirit will appear? Most of them are nonsense, but apparently there are a few that can happen under just the right conditions. Ken said maybe it's all about certain requirements lining up, and if they accidentally do, a real phenomenon occurs. For me, I guess the cause was fooling around. I had just bought a car, just started living on my own, and I was earning a decent salary compared to my part-time days, so on weekends, I was partying a lot. Early in August, Ken and I and 2 girls we'd met went on a test of courage to a so-called haunted location. Sure, it was scary. I got chills and felt like something might be there, but nothing actually happened. We had our thrill and went home. 3 days later, I came back from work late one evening. Our company had an unwritten rule that new employees couldn't leave before their boss did. So I was exhausted. Even now, I don't understand why, but I did a forbidden action in front of the full-length mirror by my room's entrance. I don't think I planned to test anything on purpose, the idea just popped into my head. Let me explain the layout of my place. I was renting a 1-room apartment about a 15-minute walk from the station, roughly 8 tatami mats in size. You'd enter through a narrow hallway, and the main room was beyond it. The mirror stood right where the hallway opened into that main space. Ken had told me a story along the lines of, if you face a mirror, hold your body in position A, and then turn to the right, you'll see something B. It was kind of like making a slight bow. I mumbled, "No way that's true," and bowed, turning my head to the right. Something was there, in the middle of the room. It was clearly abnormal in appearance. About 160 centimeters tall, with long, disheveled hair hanging down to its waist like a curtain. There seemed to be talisman papers plastered over its face, so I couldn't see any actual features. It wore a white burial robe, meant for the dead, and it swayed gently side to side. I couldn't move, or even speak. All I could do was try to make sense of it at lightning speed. Picture a cramped 1-room apartment, with something in the silent middle of the floor. Part of my mind understood it was there because I had tried Ken's forbidden action, but I still couldn't accept that this was happening. It was beyond creepy. The light was on, which somehow made it worse, because I could see it so clearly, tinged with a bluish glow. Time felt frozen. I decided my only move was to get out. Moving very slowly, I picked up my bag near my feet. I couldn't break eye contact, convinced that if I looked away, something awful might happen. Step by step, I backed toward the hallway. Normally it was just 3 steps away, but it felt endless. Around halfway, the thing swaying became broader. It also began letting out a low moan. After that point, my memory blurs. Next thing I knew, I was in the convenience store near the station. Being inside that store with other people gave me some relief, though in my head I was still reeling. I was angry and terrified, thinking, what was that? And I forgot to lock my door. But also strangely calm. I never went back to my apartment that night. Instead, I spent the evening at a family restaurant, waiting for dawn. When the sky began to lighten, I forced myself to open my apartment door. Thank God, it was gone. I even stepped out again, smoked a cigarette with a canned coffee, half convincing myself I'd imagined it. In daylight, plus the fact it wasn't there anymore, I felt a little braver. So I entered my place, thinking, yes, there's nothing here, until I turned on the light. Because the curtains were drawn, it was dim, and then I saw undeniable evidence. Right about where the thing had been standing was a vile-smelling black sludge, like thick mud. Not just footprints, a huge amount of it. In that moment, I couldn't deny last night's events. Suddenly, I realized I hadn't turned off the light at all the previous night. It dawned on me that the switch itself was smeared with the same mud. After a few moments of shock, I thought, well, it appeared nothing I can do now, and I cleaned up, took a shower, and went to work. That might sound bizarre, but it's in my nature. I just kept going. Missing work was a big deal for me. The smell lingered, and it irritated me, but I still went to the office. When I arrived, everything was as usual. I tried to corner Ken about it. I finally managed to talk to him at lunch. I said something like, "Remember that thing about position A in front of the mirror, turning right, and seeing something B? I did that last night, and something really showed up." He was confused, at first refusing to believe me, so I calmly explained exactly what had happened, the figure in my room, the disgusting sludge, and how terrified I was. Eventually, he seemed half convinced, and we decided he'd come see for himself after work. That night, we managed to leave around 10. The moment I opened my apartment door, the awful stench, sealed in all day, burst out. It was thick, hot, and nauseating. Hearing my story on the drive over, Ken muttered, "You gotta be kidding." But he seemed to believe me now. The bigger question was whether Ken could help solve it. He only told me I should get an exorcism, that he'd ask around among his acquaintances, then left. It was the best I could hope for. I certainly didn't want to stay there, so I spent the night in a capsule hotel. The next day, I tried going to various temples and shrines in Tokyo, but the priests basically said I was just tired or imagining things. Worn out, I decided to return to my family's home in Saitama. Specifically, I thought of a Buddhist nun I'll call Reverend S, who often helped my maternal grandmother. My mother is from Nagasaki, and my grandmother, who lived there, was a devout Buddhist, attending Reverend S's small temple regularly. From a previous experience in our family, I knew Reverend S was the real deal, not some shady psychic. By the time I reached the bus stop near my parents' house, it was nearly 9 at night, and the roads were empty. As I walked the last 20 minutes, I kept recalling that thing. Thankfully, nothing appeared. But I noticed a strange heat at the base of my neck. It felt like someone tugging a rope back and forth. When I touched it, it was hot and started stinging, like a rash. It got so intense that I sprinted the rest of the way. Inside the house, I found my mother just hanging up the phone. She told me my grandmother had called, worried about me, saying that Reverend S felt something was wrong. My mom asked what on earth I'd done, then suddenly noticed the bright red line around my neck. I glimpsed myself in the entryway mirror. It looked like a rope burn with tiny bumps. I started trembling uncontrollably and ran upstairs to chant Namu Amida Butsu in front of a small Buddha statue. Alarmed, my father came rushing in, and my mother phoned my grandmother again in tears. That was the moment I realized there was no escape, that this was truly dire. The next 3 days passed in a haze. I had a high fever for 2 of them, with odd sweats around my neck, and even some slight bleeding. By the 3rd morning, the fever eased, but my neck itched horribly, like stinging pain whenever it touched blankets or clothes. I tried to ignore it, but eventually checked the mirror and saw that the redness had faded, replaced by swollen welts, like oversized pimples filled with pus. It was so disgusting that I nearly threw up right there. I washed it off, applied ointment, and lay back down in despair. The only thing I could think was, why me? Suddenly, my phone rang. It was Ken. Even a tiny hope meant everything at that point, so I was relieved to hear his voice. He apologized, saying he asked around among his hometown friends, but no one really understood. Then he mentioned a friend of a friend who specialized in such things, but they charged a fee. Maybe 500,000 yen. That was a lot for me, but I had no other options. I said yes, let's do it. That same day, my mother was also arranging for Reverend S to come, but she wouldn't arrive for another 3 weeks, so I had to endure until then. Late that night, Ken called and said he could bring that specialist the next day, which was a Sunday. I agreed. I barely cared about work at that point, I just needed a solution. That night, I had a dream of a young woman in a white kimono, kneeling by my bed, bowing deeply and then leaving. I don't know if it was related. The next day, around midday, Ken arrived with a friend and a man in his late 30s who introduced himself as Mr. Hayashi. Probably an alias. He looked like a thug, not someone obviously religious. My parents were confused and suspicious. Hayashi claimed he'd done a lot of exorcisms, said it was in real danger, and insisted on a high fee. After some negotiation and fear that no one else would help, my parents reluctantly agreed. That evening, Hayashi came with candles, amulets, a crystal ball, prayer beads, and a cup of what I assumed was sake. He asked my parents to wait outside in the car, warning that the spirit might move to them otherwise. Night fell, and he began chanting while flicking droplets of sake on me as I lay on my futon. At first, it sounded like sutras, but gradually it grew disjointed, faltering. My neck began to throb with pain worse than before. Then, the chanting just stopped. It felt abrupt, not like a ritual ending. The sense of dread grew. My whole body bristled with chills, and I felt something pressing down on the futon, as if someone were straddling me. Telling myself don't open your eyes, I still did. I saw Hayashi on my right, but across from him practically leaning over me was that same figure. They were inches apart, as if face to face. It tilted its head like an owl, whispering something I couldn't understand, and Hayashi drooled with his eyes downcast and an eerie grin. Occasionally, he nodded as though he understood. I felt frozen in horror. Suddenly, the figure turned its attention to me. I shut my eyes and pulled the covers over my head, chanting Namu Amida Butsu. I heard a clatter, footsteps rushing downstairs, and realized Hayashi had fled. My parents ran in after a bit, found me frozen under the blanket. They said Hayashi had bolted to his car, taking Ken and Ken's friend with him. Later, Ken told me Hayashi only said drive, and kept trembling. Far from solving my problem, this left me more terrified than ever, and I still had nearly 3 weeks before Reverend S could arrive. Another 4 days passed. My neck was physically better, but I couldn't stop imagining that thing appearing at any moment. I barely slept or ate. I grew so haggard that my parents told my boss I was quitting. Finally, they forced me into the car, my father saying, "Don't worry, it'll be okay," and drove off without telling me the destination. My mother stroked my head while I dozed off in the back. They said I slept for a day and a half straight. When I woke, the sun was high and we were in Nagasaki, on a road with train tracks in the median. My grandparents live in an area called Yanagawa, and we parked at the bottom of a slope while my parents went to fetch them. I waited alone in the car, and again my neck flared up with agonizing pain. I touched it and found blood. I broke down, sobbing, cursing my situation. A moment later, my parents returned with my grandparents, who panicked at the sight of me bleeding and crying. They all tried to talk to me at once. I lost my temper, snapped at them to shut up, and my father who had never once hit me slapped me hard across the face. It shocked me enough that I apologized to everyone, calmed down, and realized they were just trying to help. We headed straight to Reverend S's house, which was also a small temple. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a slight relief, maybe just psychological. An older man greeted us and led us to a tatami room with a Buddhist altar where Reverend S was seated. She was calm, quietly facing the altar, and then she turned around. My grandparents were clearly comforted just by her presence. They urged my parents to rest next door, leaving me alone with her. She asked me to come closer, so I knelt in front of her. She held my hands in silence for a moment, then gently asked if I was scared. I poured out my frustration. What's going to happen to me? Please fix this fast. Why is it stalking me? I haven't done anything so terrible. In that moment, a strange voice echoed near my left ear. It was a shrill, parrot-like repetition of why, as though demanding some explanation. Reverend S's face went blank, and I saw something in my peripheral vision. Blood trickled down my neck. The figure was there, bent forward, staring into my face even though we were in a temple. It looked exactly the same, white funeral robe, talisman stuck to its face, and hair covering it all. It kept repeating why, in that parrot-like tone. Inside, I was screaming, stop. I saw its hand begin peeling off one of the talismans, like it wanted to show me its face. Then, suddenly, I heard a sharp clap. I literally jumped, my heart pounding. It was Reverend S, clapping her hands loudly. That shock snapped me out of it. My legs were numb from kneeling, and I stumbled, hitting my head against the wall. Everything was chaos for a moment, but Reverend S shouted, "Not yet. Don't come in." Probably to my parents outside. Somehow, I stopped moving. After a pause, she told me softly it was safe and that I could come back over. She apologized for scaring me, handed me a towel to wipe the blood from my face, and asked if I had seen it and heard it. I told her I had, that it kept saying why? Over and over. She asked if it had harmed me beyond scaring me, pointing out that it seemed to have no real malice, just frightening intensity. She then explained that sometimes spirits aren't necessarily evil but can be too strong and lonely, longing for someone to notice them. Apparently, I gave off a warmth that it found appealing. That idea confused me, but Reverend S calmly reassured me she would help. She said something I'll never forget: even if it looks terrifying, remember it suffers in its own way. Think of it as someone wanting help. Then she began chanting in a way that seemed more like a prayer for it to find peace. That night, I stayed over because she saw how shaky I was, and for the first time in ages, I slept soundly despite my head wound and torn skin on my neck. Next morning, she was already done with her morning devotions by the time I awoke. She told me, "Let's have breakfast and then head to the main temple." The tradition she belonged to was a major Buddhist sect with a large following across Japan. There were two main temples, east and west, and she decided we should go to the western main temple so they could help and also pray for the entity. My grandmother loved the idea. My father still seemed uneasy, but we went anyway. At the main temple, a young priest greeted her with deep respect, and I realized she must be someone of high standing. They arranged for me to stay there for a while, following something close to the monk's routine. It was there that I realized I was lucky by comparison to others I met: a woman haunted by a snake spirit for 40 years, a man from a once noble lineage whose entire family had been cursed. Their suffering was immense. Between the temple lifestyle and knowing Reverend S was helping, my constant terror subsided somewhat, though sometimes I still sensed that thing near me. A month passed, and Reverend S visited to see how I was doing, asking if I'd seen it again. I said no, maybe it had left for good. She only said, "That might not be the reason," then reassured me she wasn't trying to scare me. She wanted me to stay longer, so I did, ending up there for 3 months in total. She visited again after 2 months, and finally, about 5 months after this all began, she said I could go home. Before I left, she told me, "I think you'll be okay. But try to come see me once a month for a while. Just in case." She never claimed the spirit was definitively gone, only that she couldn't sense it near me. So I returned home. My mother had already closed out my apartment lease. Apparently, when she first opened that place, it smelled like something had been burned, and a swarm of insects lay in the center. She fled immediately, then came back the next day to find the insects gone but the smell lingering. I'm grateful I never saw it myself. Back at my parents' house, I turned on my phone for the first time in almost half a year. It was flooded with missed calls and messages, especially from Ken, who'd been sending apologies and suggestions. He'd even visited once. On my second night back, I called him. I heard the sound of a party in the background, and he was clearly drunk. I felt anger rising and hung up, texting him something like, "I'll kill you. Sometimes it's just how it is. Other people can't fully share your terror." He asked to come apologize in person. I agreed. That evening, when I opened the door, I punched him twice, once to ease his guilt, once out of raw anger that he was partying while I was suffering. Oddly enough, it seemed to relieve tension on both sides. We spent the night talking, going over everything. He told me what happened after he fled with Hayashi in the car. Hayashi was basically having a breakdown, muttering, "It's not me," and shaking uncontrollably, so Ken had bailed out at a stoplight. Eventually, Ken learned Hayashi was a scammer just looking for easy money. Nobody has any idea what became of him. Afterward, Ken tried using all his connections but never found a true expert who understood what had happened. The best anyone could say was that certain conditions had lined up. Nothing definitive. I followed Reverend S's instructions, visiting her monthly for a year, then every 3 months the next year. Ken, feeling responsible, stayed in touch more than ever, always wanting updates. About 2 years after I first saw the entity, Reverend S finally said, "I think it's all right now. Just visit sometimes and be careful." 3 months later, she passed away, and I'll always respect her. I wish I could have learned more. Is it truly over? I don't know. 2 months have passed since her funeral. My life feels normal, and sometimes those months seem so distant I wonder if it really happened. I haven't told anyone else. I just live my day-to-day life. Then, out of nowhere, a letter arrived from my grandmother containing a second letter from Reverend S. She had left it with my grandmother to send me after her 49-day memorial service. I won't quote it verbatim, but I'll paraphrase. She apologized for not telling me how frightened she actually was, because the spirit was more than she could handle alone. She said that sometimes no matter how much you try to help a spirit, it won't respond, but in my case, we were lucky. She explained that if I ever felt tormented again, I should go back to the main temple, where it would be harder for such an entity to follow. And if the suffering truly became unbearable, I should entrust myself to the Buddha. Not meaning I should die, but that if the haunting wasn't over, It could potentially drag on indefinitely, causing unimaginable suffering. She prayed to save me but couldn't be sure she'd succeeded. "Don't let your guard down," she wrote. "It might just be hiding, waiting for you to relax." Reading that, my hands shook, my heart pounded, and I felt sweat on my brow. Could it still not be over? I suddenly felt it could be lurking anywhere, watching. Maybe it targeted her, too. Maybe nothing had changed, and it was waiting for a chance. I thought of what it might have whispered to Hayashi to break him. Maybe everything Reverend S told me was a gentle lie to keep me calm. My mind spiraled with doubt, and I had no idea what to believe. That's all I know. It was 2.5 years of not knowing if it really ended. I found no conclusive reason for why it happened or some all-knowing expert to fix it. Maybe it was a weird combination of factors, or something deeper I don't understand. It felt too cruel to be mere chance. I can't recall doing anything so terrible as to deserve it. So why me? All I can say is this: if you ever get possessed, stalked, or targeted by something beyond understanding, it's no laughing matter. Even if someone says it's over, never fully let your guard down. Lastly, I owe an apology. I've included a few small lies in this story - little details to make it more coherent, or because I didn't fully understand some parts. I'm sorry if it caused confusion, but there's a bigger deception at the heart of it. You probably never noticed, but I felt I had to present it this way for you to grasp my experience. You might feel betrayed, but I had to share this with someone. I'm actually Ken. And no matter how I regret it, I can't ever undo what I've done.